Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Forrest. I'm with Extinction Rebellion DC. Welcome to our Degrowth webinar with the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. I'm honored with the task of introducing our speakers to you tonight. First, we're going to hear from Brian Check, who founded the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, which we call it CASSE, in 2003. And he's been the executive director of CASSE since 2017. From 1999 until 2017, Brian served in the headquarters of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where he developed the conservation biology program for their national wildlife refuge system and played a role in climate change planning. He also was a visiting professor at Virginia Tech. Earlier in Brian's career, he was a wildlife biologist for tribal and federal agencies. He turned his focus to ecological economics and political science during his PhD research at the University of Arizona. And he's published over 50 articles in peer-reviewed journals and authored 4 books, the latest of which is Gag Order No More, the 800-Pound Gorilla in the US Government, which was published by the Steady State Press. And after Brian's bit, we'll be also hearing from Alex Underwood, the managing director at CASSE. She manages CASSE's blog outlet, the Steady State Herald. She writes articles on the ecological footprint of economic activities and environmental and social justice. Alex used to work in international food policy, used to conduct research on U.S. air pollution governance, and also served in Peace Corps Panama's sustainable agriculture sector. Alex has a master's degree in global affairs with a concentration in sustainable development from the University of Notre Dame. She's passionate about degrowth to a steady state economy as a necessary solution to environmental crises. So without further ado, Brian, take us away.
Well, thank you so much, Forrest. And thanks to Extinction Rebellion, speaking for CASSE staff, the CASSE board, probably our 17,000 signatories to the CASSE position. We greatly appreciate Extinction Rebellion. I mean, I can't think of a better thing to rebel against than extinction. And in fact, I'm going to start bringing up some slides here and remind some of us and inform others that, you know, before climate change was even recognized as, or before there was a consensus about climate change, before the government agencies could deal with climate change explicitly, politically, and so on, biodiversity collapse was the big environmental issue of the day of the 90s, most of the first decade of the 20th century. And I'll always remember E.O. Wilson's quote, "The loss of species is the folly our descendants are least likely to forgive." And whether it's because of climate change, because of pollution in general, because of habitat loss, because of over harvest, biodiversity loss is an awful, awful thing. And so, of course, our contribution this evening largely will be those causes. Why are species blinking out? And so we'll be talking about what those causes redound to, the big picture causation. All right, and to do that, we want to talk about the economy. So I want to bring you around. Let's have a look at the global economy with a bit of a focus on North American economic scenes. We're going to start on the ground, in the fields, where the food is produced, the wheat and the corn and the rice, you know, the staple crops that feed all of us so that we can do anything else. And more, we're also talking about soy. In this case, you see it in an extremely fragile, simplified ecosystem of Roundup Ready soybeans. And if you really want to take a closer look, you can see it shows damage from dicamba besides. So we've got, you know, a double whammy on the ecosystem in terms of pesticides. Now we're looking over Kansas, central Kansas, and if you haven't seen this type of pattern from the air or satellite imagery or whatever, this is what it looks like on the ground. It's pivot agriculture. And this water is coming from the Oglala Aquifer, which, as you guys know, it's scheduled for extinction, you might call it itself, although as a conservation biologist, I like to be strict with that term. But anyway, it's drying up. Let's just say that. And by 2050, economically, it'll be largely gone for irrigation purposes. But this is happening all over the world. It's not just in this breadbasket of the American Midwest. This is pivot agriculture in Saudi Arabia. And this is what it looks like on the ground in that part of the world. This is Qatar, actually. But, as the water, the aquifers are drying up, and it's not even entirely in places where we have to resort to irrigation or aquifer depletion. It's in places where we've always thought of as having plenty of riparian area and water. Even in Bolivian Amazon, there is so much stress for food production with 8 billion people on the planet and a globalized economy that water stresses are all over now in all types of hydrological scenarios. And so we're getting more ag fields looking like this, partly because of climate change, partly because of the aquifer depletion, and partly because of the pesticides. Once again, a Roundup Ready soybean field drying up. And all these fields are to feed us, but also to feed cattle for our dairy and our meat production, and even for pet food production. And and not all of the cattle grown is grown in such types of systems. We've had since the 1880s in the United States tremendous problems of overgrazing in the 11 western states, the more arid states. And so that is as bad as ever. And, we've got the factory farming of the poultry, the factory farming of the pork, the factory farming of fish. It's a very, very intensive, polluting kind of operation at this point. And then, of course, all that activity is what leads up to the canning of the final goods. Canning of vegetables, the packing of fish, the packing of the red meats that, we're being reminded now we ought to be eating more of. So, and then we've also got orchards that are extremely intensive. This one you can see is actually being wiped out for purposes of development. But anyway, I bring that sort of as a segue from the food producing activities on the ground to the most closely related extractive activities on the ground. So here we have plants also, big woody plants being harvested. And these are being harvested at unsustainable rates. We're at second and third and even fourth phase logging, clear cutting in some parts of the country now. And all of that is eventually winds up at a sawmill or a pulp mill, and it's used to produce the intermediate products that wind up going into the final goods that lead to economic product, all the way up to little things like toothpicks. And then we can move over to the next extractive sector. We have the big mountaintop mining for coal, and the open pit copper mining, and bauxite and rare metals mining for aluminum and metals. And, and then we bring these things to the refineries, to the smelters, and we little by little produce heavy equipment that is then used to produce lighter manufacturers that either become final goods or become, a part of the process toward a final good. Now, this one might get you curious, and it turns out, I remember the history of this one. It looks like it might be a really high-tech water bottling plant. It's actually a combination of plastics and water. And so we have this activity going on. And during the past minute or so, since we're talking about the refining of metals and so on, 100 million bottles, 100 million bottles were sold. So it's one of the most frequently sold products in the world. And so now, we're leaving the fields, we're getting more into the manufacturing plants, and we've got plants where we've got combinations of light and heavy manufacturing going on, and both for the domestic fleet and for military operations. And then we've got some of the labor for that, and more of that though is automated and robotic and in fact led more and more frequently by robots per se. So say hello to the new boss there. And then don't forget all of the containers even to ship all these goods to all over the planet. There you see a plastics dominated shipping factory, and here you have Amazon packing plant, cardboard. And then you get furthest removed from the field, where you get some very, very light types of manufacturing, all the way up to the computer chip manufacturing, some nanotechnology in the labs, and this activity sort of gradates, you might say, into a sector that's generally categorized as a service sector, information provision. But as we know, that doesn't mean it's dematerialized. That takes tremendous amounts of water and energy. And that's sort of your tour around the world and its major economic sectors, or at least some of the main highlights. Oh, actually, no, we don't want to forget about the infrastructure. How does all that energy, how does all that water, and how does the labor and the capital get there? We've got tremendously complicated now and environmentally impacting infrastructure. Now, to do any of this stuff, we have to have energy. Certain amount of it, a very limited amount can be done purely with solar energy and with the photosynthesis process in the economy of nature. But most of this is taking tremendous amounts of stocks of fossil fuels, waters, which to some degree renewable with all the complications of sedimentation and reservoirs and so on. But there's just more and more of this required. So we're really scraping bottom of the barrel in some places for things like tar sands. And then going all the way to the other end of the throughput, then, after all of that production and consumption that we looked at, all of those sectors, there's going to be pollution. There will be, pursuant to the second law of thermodynamics, there cannot be 100% efficiency in the production process. If you tried to get there, theoretically you might, and you know how long it would take you? Infinity. That's how the second law of thermodynamics. So the fact is, in political economy, you're not going to get anywhere near a very high level of efficiency. You'll be selected for if you produce fast, and that's you can dig into the maximum power principle to study more of that. But pollution there will be, so this you might call the tailpipe of all that economic activity. So now let's kind of summarize things. All that activity, that was the economy, and economic growth is simply an increase in the production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. So it's not just the tin cans, it's not just e-bikes, it's not just solar panels, it's all that activity in the aggregate that's growing, and that's expressed in terms of GDP, or gross domestic product. and that entails a growing population and or per capita production and consumption. Well, the opposite of that is degrowth, a decrease in the production and consumption of goods and services. And we're not talking about, all of the political connotations that come along, say, with the degrowth movement in Europe. But what we're talking about here is degrowth per se, the alternative, one of the two alternatives to growth. And it also is expressed in terms of GDP, and it entails a decreasing population and or per capita production and consumption. So there's one other alternative, neither growth nor degrowth, and that's the steady state, stabilized production and consumption, also expressed in terms of GDP, entailing stabilized population and or per capita. So, you guys realize in Extinction Rebellion that because of ecological carrying capacity for the human economy, growth becomes unsustainable. Growth is unsustainable. And, we might call that the ceiling for the economy. And then this would be the floor. When you have too much degrowth, you don't have survival, you don't have peace, you don't have health. So if you're familiar with the donut economy, well, this is the area outside the donut. This is in the hole of the hell hole of the donut. And this is the sweet spot. And the best of all is somewhere in here. You don't want to be bumping up against the ceiling or scraping around the floor. You're hoping for a steady state. It's not going to be flatlined. It's going to be fluctuating, and hopefully it's not fluctuating too wildly. Hopefully it's fluctuating pretty moderately and ideally around some optimum level. And at CASSE, we wear that whole concept on our logo. And you've probably heard of projects out there like the Half Earth initiative and Nature Needs Half. Fine efforts by the likes of E.O. Wilson and other organizations. And you know what? We've been at that since the get-go. We just happened to come upon half of the earth left for biodiversity and half allocated to human economy. But as you know, I don't think we're in this position anymore. We're in an overshoot scenario. So we have to ask ourselves the question, and we have to discuss this evening the prospects for degrowth toward that under the K, under the ceiling, steady state, recognizing that some countries are pretty far over their capacity, their biological capacity. Some are because of raw population, raw numbers of people. Some are more because of gaudy levels of personal consumption expenditures. And then there are other entire nations that desperately need economic growth per se. And for the record, CASSE is by no means has ever called for a steady state now or degrowth, much less degrowth in countries in dire need of growth. So we view this challenge of having these efforts meet as the big challenge of the 21st century. Steady statesmanship, we call it, as it plays out in international affairs. Okay, now if you've ever taken a business course or basic econ, you will have been introduced to this real crude model of the economy called the circular flow of money. Money is flowing between firms and households, labor and capital. And this will be one of your primary imprints on your poor brain if you've been a primarily business student. Because I say on your poor brain, because how are you supposed to think about limits to growth and ecological macroeconomics here? This is all you get. You get labor and capital. So when you think about economic growth, well, this is what you think of. It's an ever expanding circular flow of money. More goods, more services, more labor, more capital, more money. So we have introduced what we call the trophic theory of money, which better aligns with ecological principles, and we like to consider it the ecological economics theory of money. We start with trophic levels in the economy of nature. We know that the producers are plants. They literally produce their own food in the process of photosynthesis. And when you get enough of that happening over evolutionary time, then you get the evolution of consumers, animals that eat plants. It's not just an evolutionary process. In seasonal time, in annual time, you have to have enough producers out there to support populations of these species that evolved. And so you have producers, primary consumer, and then same thing with the secondary consumers, the carnivores and omnivores that will eat primary consumers. And you know, theologically, conceptually, cosmologically, we don't want to necessarily say, hey, you're not part of the picture here, Homo sapiens. You are actually, we are part of the economy of nature. And the thing is that in our case, these trophic levels are needing to be modified in the sense that it's not just a matter of ingestion and energy processing physiologically, like to grow bodies and reproduce and so on. It's all of the appurtenances that and artifacts that we're powering and running and entertaining ourselves and others with. So in that sense, we've got to be considered at the top of this trophic structure. And then that makes it a little bit easier to understand the fundamental conflict between growing the economy and conserving biodiversity, because as that human economy expands, it's sort of like a trophic compression of all of the other non-human species. It's like a squishing of them out. It's their extinction, little by little. And here's another way of putting that, once again, with ecological carrying capacity. Prior to humans, prior to Homo sapiens, all of that natural capital out there in the world, the woods, the waters, the soils, the minerals, fisheries, and so on, all of that was allocated to the non-human species as their habitats. Now, in the process of GDP growth, first the evolution of humans and then the development of industrial economy and so on, that natural capital is reallocated over to the human economy, where it's transformed into producer and consumer goods and services and infrastructure and so on. And this was a collage that spoke thousands of words about one of my favorite artworks of all time, because it shows the economy coming out of the proverbial wilderness, and then it's developing its own trophic structure, agricultural and extractive. And if you use your imagination, you can see some manufacturing going on there, and then all into the urban core of the services and so on. And it starts out by endangering these large-bodied K-selected species, as you ecologists might call them. And little by little, it's into every little nook and cranny, where it's endangering even the little R-selected fast population growth species. And so human economy growing at the competitive exclusion of non-human species in the aggregate. So we like to say at CASSE that biodiversity conservation is a steady state economy. Okay, now, if you do want to consider Homo sapiens outside of that economy of nature, well, we have a trophic structure to our economy too, and we've got the producers, the agricultural and extractive sectors, upon which the manufacturing relies, from the heaviest to the lightest. And so now this trophic theory of money is that money originates via that agricultural surplus that frees the hands for the division of labor into the manufacturing and the services sectors. And if you want to know more about the trophic theory of money, you can Google up the paper here where I kicked it off in 2019. We've got a number of articles at the Steady State Herald about it. And I was very pleased to find today there is a developing literature finally in the ecological community about this too. All right, so here's the main point. Before any of this very lightweight sort of tinkering and these these dematerializing information activities are supposed to be happening before you get any of that. And while you're trying to maintain that, there's got to be a lot of this. That's how a trophic structure works. It's big at the base, and then you get the opportunities to get lesser amounts. And so the primary corollary is that GDP is an indicator of environmental impact. So here you see the trophic structure of the human economy. You want that economy to grow, and it must, by virtue of the fact that agricultural and extractive activity is anything but environmentally impactful. And yet we hear that sometimes, we hear sometimes still from economists and techno-optimists that, well, if we just grow the economy enough, then we're going to have enough money. We can solve all these problems. And little by little, we'll get rid of the problems. And that's called the environmental Kuznets curve. Interesting history behind it. What they're talking about is the development of new technology, especially technology for increasing productive efficiency. The problem is that, where does that come from? Because these two types of technological progress obviously aren't going to help. We're only going to be using up more resources with those. You've got to increase efficiency. The problem is you need the money to conduct the R&D. That comes from profits, or more generally economic surplus. And that ultimately comes, I'm going to have to skip a slide here so we don't interfere with the remainder. But here's the part that escapes notice. Where does the money come to maintain that cycle of profits and R&D? It's called economies of scale. And that means the reduction in cost of product simply from increasing the level of output. It's a valid approach to increasing efficiency. And across the whole economy, macroeconomically, that means total factor productivity is increasing. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that's based on existing levels of technology. So you're still causing those environmental problems while you are trying to develop the new technologies. Now I'm in arrears, so I'll close out here by just mentioning that in terms of optimality, that's what we really view at CASSE as the big project for democracy in the 21st century. A lot of us, like myself, are down here. GDP is already way too big. Others, like Woody Allen, if he's still around, that's way up here. So we're striving for the democratic optimum. And, there's different ways of looking at it. And we have some metrics that help us to, let me just close with a very fancy term. I apologize for the abstruse nature of this term from political science, but it's muddling toward. We are muddling toward optimality. We don't know exactly how to measure it. We know there are a bunch of relevant measurements, though, that help us feel our way there. And so that's the end of part one. And I'm greatly looking forward to Alex, our fantastic managing editor at CASSE, to provide the next part of the talk.
But I'm Alex, everyone. And before I dive in, I also want to start with a little thank you to the Extinction Rebellion folks who reached out to make this webinar happen, and also to the almost 50 of you who are here on a Wednesday night, especially with so much going on in the world right now. And I really passionately believe that as long as our governments, our financial institutions, our businesses keep striving for economic growth, especially in wealthy countries and contexts, all of our environmental activism, and to a certain extent, social justice activism too, is going to be an uphill battle. And so I'm really thankful for an opportunity to discuss this with you all, and I hope that you find it fruitful. So, now that Brian sort of laid the groundwork for what is degrowth to a steady state economy and why we need it, I am going to discuss some steady state policies just a few because it would be impossible to cover them all in this amount of time. And then I'm going to put forward some ideas for what steady state activism might look like. And apparently I like fours because I have four steady state policy buckets to discuss and four what I'm calling levels of steady state activism. So how do we do it? How do we degrow to a steady state economy? Um, Side note here that I'm going to use the term post-growth some, and I'm going to use it sort of as an umbrella term that includes both the degrowth and the steady state economy movements. So for some people, the post-growth movements represent bottom-up changes in culture, lifestyle, and values, while others place more emphasis on top-down changes in our governments and financial institutions. And there's a little bit of tension and debate about which of those approaches is the most effective. And I say if we're really going to do this, we need all of the above. That said, CASSE tends to focus on the policy approach, so that's what we'll discuss more today. Another important caveat is that in modern history, we have no examples of big wealthy countries like the United States doing this, degrowing to a steady state economy. So we really can't say definitively, this is the set of policies that is for sure going to make it happen. But we have a lot of great ideas proposed by experts in economics, ecology, political science. And we think that to make it happen, we need change on all fronts. So the post-growth movement is this very wide-ranging, diverse movement with so many different policy proposals ranging from food policy, housing policy, population policy, everything in between. And I think that's one of the superpowers of the movement, and also makes it a little bit difficult if a policymaker, let's say, is sold and they're like, yeah, okay, we need to degrow to a steady state economy. They might not know where to begin. So, not to toot our own horn, but I think that is a niche that CASSE fills very well because we are actually developing legislation that can be taken to the Hill. We have a Steady State Economy Act that is federal legislation designed for the United States. And we have been building it out with what we call feeder bills that cover different policy topics. And if reading legislation in your free time isn't something a lot of you like to do, we also introduce each of those feeder bills with an article in our blog outlet, the Steady State Herald, that kind of breaks down the policy principles at play in each one. And I'm showcasing here just some of those feeder bills that I think are really foundational or unique. But I suggest you check out the full suite on our website. So yeah, I'm going to dive into those four policy buckets that I mentioned and use an example from our Steady State Economy Act for each one. So the first one is directly limiting resource use and pollution. And these are the types of policies that I learned about in my environmental policy class in grad school. This is your bread and butter environmental policy. And some of them are command and control policies where you simply limit the amount of extraction or production or pollution that can happen and penalize corporations that go over. And then there are market-based policies like taxes and subsidies. In post-growth literature, there's a lot of talk of ending perverse subsidies for, environmentally harmful industries. And often seen as kind of a crossover of the command and control and the market-based policies are cap and trade programs. And we actually have a cap and trade feeder bill called the Natural Resources and Electricity Cap and Trade Act. And what's unique about that bill is that most cap and trade programs focus on extraction or production or pollution, but we are proposing capping at the consumption level. So capping electricity use at the corporation or household level. And just a little plug that at CASSE, we prefer the direct command and control approach. And if you're interested to learn why, you could ask about that in the Q&A. But I'm going to move on to the second bucket. So these other policies I'll discuss are not typically what you think of when you think of environmental policy. They're more economic or financial policies. And the second bucket I'm discussing here is wealth redistribution. So that's wealth taxes, that's progressive taxation, which, if you don't know, means that the tax rate increases as income increases. And that might be sort of the lowest hanging fruit because there are a lot of movements for wealth taxes and progressive taxation by people who have probably never heard of ecological economics. It's a pretty popular movement. And even last year at the G20, there was a billionaire tax proposed that I was pretty excited about. Um, and we, with the Steady State Economy Act, have a Sustainable Taxes Act, which we consider one of the cornerstone bills for the act. And that essentially calls for progressive taxation. However, we think that ideally we would go beyond taxing wealth that has already been accumulated and instead cap wealth or cap income. So everybody's familiar with income floors. We have minimum wage in the United States, and the movements for guaranteed income and universal basic income are large and popular. But we propose salary caps. And to that end, we have a Salary Cap Act. The third policy bucket is labor. And the premise here is that reducing economic production means reducing work. And this is why many people find degrowth unthinkable because they associate recessions with unemployment. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can share work more effectively by shortening the work week, and we can make sure that no one gets left behind using training programs to transition people from sunset industries to jobs that would still be necessary in a steady state economy. And of course, to ensure that the working class has sufficient income in this sort of shorter work week scenario, these policies would need to be coupled with the wealth redistribution policies that I mentioned in the last slide. And our Steady State Economy Act example here is the 32-hour Workweek Act, which is my personal favorite. Fourth bucket I'll discuss, and once again, I'm not covering all of it, is financial and monetary reform. And actually, this is the last set of policies that we've yet to develop feeder bills for, so stay tuned for these. But that would entail Treasury and Federal Reserve reform. It would entail private banking reform. And one that I'm personally really passionate about is reform of debt infrastructure. Just a little plug for my Steady State Herald article here on the debt crisis in the Global South, and also for Debt for Climate, because that is an example of an activist group that has done some work in DC. So I've been using our federal Steady State Economy Act for examples thus far, but steady state policies can be applied at any level of government. And we actually have a program that's focused on county level policy. We call it Keep Our Counties Great, which is a play on a slogan that everybody's familiar with. And we're particularly excited about this initiative right now because we see local government as a more promising venue for steady state change at the moment. We have a policy specialist, Dave Rollo, who has written 22 Steady State Herald articles on county governance. Most of these are county case studies, and we like to focus on bright spot cases where locals have organized to influence policy or maybe to keep a big developer at bay. So for the activists in the crowd, you can find some good examples of successful activism in those articles. Dave Rollo is also building out a database of all the counties in the United States and some different growth indicators that we've identified for each of them. And then a big component of that is that we're developing a county comprehensive plan template. And that is sort of the guiding policy document that counties use. And we see that as a good opportunity to weave in some steady state policies. So I put Dave Rollo's email address here if anybody's particularly interested in this program, and or if maybe you think that your county would serve as a good case study. All right, so now I'm going to turn to some ideas for steady state activism, but I want to preface this by saying that I am coming to the table steeped in this sort of post-growth world. However, I don't consider myself an expert in activism, especially nonviolent direct action. So this is the result of my brainstorming, like what I would love to see happen in activism. But I am seeing you all in the audience as the experts, and I would love to hear from you in the breakouts later on in the Q&A. So I conceptualize this in sort of four levels of steady state activism. And the first level I would say is to ask yourself, am I maybe inadvertently contributing to the mainstream green growth narrative? And that is the mainstream narrative that innovation will enable us to, quote, absolutely decouple. I think my picture's not showing up. There we go. Absolutely decouple economic growth from environmental impact. And Brian was starting to talk about this toward the end of his slideshow, but yeah, this idea that with technological innovation, we can overcome any environmental issue. And what sets post-growth movements apart from, I would say, mainstream environmental movements is that we shine light on the fact that there's no evidence, especially at the global scale, that absolute decoupling is possible. And we even have the theoretical underpinning to demonstrate that it is impossible with the trophic theory of money that Brian discussed earlier. So another way to frame this is you can ask yourself, am I calling for technological changes that will enable the extension of business as usual, the extension of consumption as usual, political structures as usual, or am I calling for systems change that will lead to less overall consumption, not just different overall consumption? Another way to put it is, am I calling for same, but different? Or am I calling for different, and less? Feel free to quote that. All right, so level 2 steady state activism is to not just avoid the green growth narrative, but to ask yourself, how could I incorporate a steady state lens into my activism? And one idea is to always strive to peel another layer off of the onion, hence my nice picture there of the red onion. So always think about the economic activity and the stakeholders behind whatever environmental harm you're opposing. And I know that so many of you do this already, so forgive any preaching to the choir that is happening, but it's just important to recognize that the most direct solution to environmental issues isn't always the most effective when you consider the issue holistically. And one example of this is the concept of leakage. So let's say you're fighting to protect something or to stop some development from happening, and you succeed. Is that just going to happen somewhere else? So returning to the concept of decoupling that I mentioned before, this is why some studies claim that wealthy countries have achieved decoupling, because those studies use production-based metrics. And oftentimes we outsource our production to other countries, or even within the United States, we outsource it to other states or neighborhoods, often marginalized ones. And so that's another kind of characteristic of the post-growth lens, is to use consumption-based metrics as opposed to production-based ones. So you can ask yourself, how do I address this issue without contributing to other issues here or elsewhere? And a good way to start answering that question is to follow the money. Who is profiting from this environmental destruction? Investors, executives, politicians, and then ask which institutions, laws, and norms are enabling these actors to continue wielding this power and continue seeking growth at the cost of the environment and ultimately all of us. And I think whatever answers you come to there can serve as the basis for a steady state campaign. All right. Level 3 of steady state activism is to incorporate the language, the degrowth to a steady state language, into your campaign messaging. And ultimately, I really think we are going to need this. We are going to need to explicitly call out growth as the problem. And Brian and I talked about just starting the conversation here, but I acknowledge that a lot of you are knee-deep in campaigns and you already have your messaging developed. And you may not be so certain that your target audience is going to receive this sort of language well or understand it. But when you're ready, the sooner the better. You can, on the one hand, frame the issue as a growth issue. So use language like growth interests are behind this environmental issue. Common phrases are limits to growth, planetary boundaries. You can talk about the growth paradigm. At CASSE, we like to use some phrases with a little pizzazz, like we reference the GDP bulldozer and the growth juggernaut. And another tip that Brian mentioned recently is we often see environmental campaigns blaming human activity, like human activity is causing XYZ. But we prefer to frame it as economic activity because that's really where the issue is. So then on the other hand is also framing the solution with degrowth and steady state economy language. You may have already noticed I've been doing this where we slap this hyphenated steady state before whatever desirable policy we're talking about. So we need steady state housing. We need to work toward a steady state future. And I think it's important to, when you use this sort of post-growth language, to really frame it positively, because I think that's one of people's biggest qualms when they hear about degrowth or steady state economy is they think that the ask is for them to reduce their quality of life, when really we have so much to gain from this sort of reform. And level 4, platinum level 4, steady state activism is to not only use the language, but also to center your campaign around degrowth to a steady state economy, to make that the primary goal. And then, of course, you would have your intermediate objectives, which may include changing public sentiment, planting seeds to influence the public's reception of the economic growth rhetoric that they get from politicians and corporations. You might, as opposed to targeting the general public, you might target groups that you perceive to have influence, like academics or big green NGOs. CASSE often utilizes that approach by attending professional society conferences, like the Wildlife Society conference, for example. Or you could go straight to the policymakers, aim for the implementation of the sort of steady state policies that I outlined earlier. And for those of you who are environmental activists, that might entail stepping out of the environment box, which I know that a lot of you already do. But I think there's also a lot of potential for partnership with organizations that already do economics and finance activism for reforms in those realms. And you can, and I think you always should, tie those economic and finance issues back to the environmental or maybe the social justice issues that are at the core of your organization's mission, because ultimately the environmental crisis is an economic crisis. And the last comment I have here is that all of this could, of course, entail official avenues, like reaching out to your political representatives at any level, county, state, federal. This is CASSE's primary approach. Or it might entail more disruptive, nonviolent direct action, which I know a lot of folks here tend to favor and which we would love to see happen and love to support in any way possible. So in preparing for this presentation, I came across some examples of this sort of level 4 steady state activism, mostly in Europe. I would love to see it in the US, but some organizations that I saw mentioned frequently were Scientist Rebellion, which is a sister organization of Extinction Rebellion, and it's composed of only scientists and academics. And then another organization I saw mentioned often is called Growth Kills. And these organizations' positions and demands on their websites revolve around degrowth. That is their primary ask. And that image, the image on the left and the one on the bottom, are from an action by Scientist Rebellion, Growth Kills, and Extinction Rebellion. They blocked the entrances to the European Commission in Brussels as part of a week of actions to demand an EU-wide degrowth program. And I hope you can see some of the wording on the signs. Green growth is a myth. And then the top right image is from a different action, a wheat pasting campaign. And it says, does economic growth bring well-being? So I found these inspirational. I hope you do too. Then I'd also like to share a few examples from the DC area because that is where we're based. And I have witnessed examples of folks implementing steady state mindset, whether they, would call it that or not. The campaign that I'm most familiar with is Stop Project Pipes, which is a campaign to convince DC's Public Service Commission to reject a proposal put forward by Washington Gas, which is a for-profit natural gas provider in the DC area. And Washington Gas wants to revamp DC's natural gas infrastructure. Of course, a very expensive project that would be paid for by residents when DC has pledged to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so I have seen local activists, especially from Extinction Rebellion, routinely exposing the fact that Washington Gas is a for-profit entity owned by AltaGas, which is a Canadian corporation. I've heard them point the finger at the shareholders and executives who would profit from this Project Pipes plan. And I actually wrote a Herald article about this campaign, and I interviewed somebody from another local organization, the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, CCAN, and she pointed out that this Public Service Commission sits under the Council's Committee for Business and Economic Development. And so they approach the issue, they approach Washington Gas as a business, and one of their priorities is to help the business profit. In addition to, providing the basic need of energy to residents. And the person I interviewed from CCAN said, we're not going to have a true clean energy transition until we start framing utilities as public works as opposed to profit endeavors. And I found this to be very steady state woke, whether she realized it or not. Along the same lines, another organization, We Power DC, fights for control of the city's energy infrastructure to shift from profit-driven monopolies to a city-owned power utility. And I believe they're mostly focused on the electricity provider, PEPCO. And then I already mentioned Debt for Climate before, but that is an organization that is definitely very aligned with steady state goals. So I just wanted these sort of examples to be fresh in our minds as we go into breakout rooms. But before we do that, I am going to put up a slide with some ways that you can get involved, and I'm going to hand it over to Carol from Extinction Rebellion to walk us through these action items.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Alex and Brian, for the great presentation. So a few ways to take action before we move into discussion and Q&A. First, you can right now sign CASSE's position on economic growth. We have the link has been posted in the chat, or you can take your phone and scan the QR code on the screen. So two ways you can get to that link. You can email Cassie, info@steadystate.org. You can sign up for XRDC's onboarding call next Wednesday at 7 p.m. And you can do that the link is also in the chat, or you can scan this QR code. You can email us at xrdc@extinctionrebelliondc@protonmail.com. And there's a DC Degrowth Book Club email list that you can join by emailing Alex. And her email address is here, and it's also in the chat. And if your appetite for taking action in DC, especially if you live in the DC area and you want to take action to join the campaign to stop Project Pipes to move to electrification in DC and stop this massive growth of the utilities in DC. You can join XRDC. You can email us. Let us know you're interested. We've got some fun stuff going on, and in fact, the Alex had mentioned that that Washington Gas was under the City Council's Business and Economic Development Committee. It's just been changed because the chairman of that committee resigned from the council. So now it's finally under Transportation and the Environment, which we've been wanting for a long time. Um, so it could mean some positive things this year. So come join us. It's a lot of fun.
Great. So I do have a slide with breakout questions, and don't feel like we need to stick with these questions. These are just to get the juices flowing. And I believe that Sage is also going to post them in the chat to have a conversation with the bigger group here. We've got 26 people still hanging on at 8:11 p.m. Eastern Time.
Alex, we had two from earlier. So one is from Nikki who asked, why do you prefer command and control? I don't know if you know what that was referring to.
Yeah. Brian's still around, right? I might kind of let Brian.
Yeah. I wouldn't mind taking a crack at that one because I don't necessarily think we have a consensus in among CASSE, among the CASSE network that should be our preferred approach to policy development. But it's definitely my preference. But now we need to think a little bit about what that means, command and control. It's not like we want to try to be benign dictators. We want a democracy that's fully functional, in which an informed public calls for steady statesmanship, elects steady state politician, prefers a salary cap act, prefers fiscal and monetary policies, policy levers and buttons that are set not constantly for 3% GDP growth, but for stabilizing and then eventually degrowing an economy, actually decreasing the ecological footprint and then moving for long haul steady state economy. Command and control is if you can manage to achieve it, it's much more efficient than say taxation toward the behaviors, the consumer and producer behaviors that you want out there. And finally, along those lines, don't forget our trophic theory of money. We want to be able to prohibit, like say, levels of production and consumption rather than pay people to do this or subsidize. And because where's that money going to come from? That money ultimately comes from that expand. If you need to expend more money that you didn't have, then you need more agro-extractive expansion at the base. We call that the trophic conundrum. You could try to solve more problems with more money, but then you're trophically impacting the environment to generate that money.
Thank you, Brian. And now I have another one from Nora. Are there existing campaigns to get news sources to report on alternative economic indexes? Most daily news reports include whether the stock market is up or down, making us all feel like we hope it's up and growing.
I can at least start that answer because actually Forrest, one of the XRDC organizers, pointed out to me recently that the state of Maryland tracks the genuine progress indicator. Am I getting that right, Brian? The GPI. And so you can find that metric on their website. I think that getting news outlets to report it might be a different matter. I don't know, Brian, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, that it's so hard to get mainstream media into real, ecological macroeconomics, sustainability matters. Because it's kind of tends to be a little deeper dive for them. They have to do some background homework and stuff. It's a lot easier just to talk about a specific environmental problem here and a specific campaign to stop it there. And but systematically we're trying. That's why we have the Steady State Herald. I mean, and which is doing quite well with Alex managing it. What's our slogan at the Steady State Herald? Original journalism, real sustainability. And we tie every article we have to that limits to growth scenario we're in at some level. And some of us are members of the SEJ, the Society of Environmental Journalists, and we've had a handful of workshops there and panel presentations where we try to encourage environmental journalists at least to take this on, and limited success so far, but it's percolating in the SEJ for sure.
Thanks, that's great. I don't know if you two can see the questions in the chat, but I'll just read out the next one from Forrest. Can you recommend some bottom-up culture change resources for thinkers or thinkers, even though that's not your guys' main MO?
Can you say it one more time?
Yeah, can you recommend some bottom-up culture change resources or thinkers?
Oh.
Well, just because I have this sitting right next to me here at my desk, the Degrowth Book Club read this Less is More by Jason Hickel. And it's a pretty comprehensive overview of degrowth and does include some top-down policy content, but it also, I think, covers pretty well the bottom-up cultural shift as well. And I will also say that in the Steady State Herald, even though with our programs we tend to focus on policy, we often publish guest authors in the Herald, and they often write about more of the cultural issues.
Thanks, Alex.
Don't forget about Reverend Billy and the Stop Shopping Choir.
Yeah.
You guys familiar with that group? I'll stick a link in here. That's definitely a ground up effort to lessen consumption. And it's funny, we haven't found the time yet to network with Reverend Billy, but we should.
You should, yeah.
Okay, we've got another question. I'll get back to for our second one, but Nick has said, amazingly, the folks at Climate Interactive have put together an effective and popular system dynamics-based effective live policy simulation. They've trained hundreds of people around the world and even at the UN. Do you think something like that could be adapted to opening people's minds to the steady state framework?
Absolutely. There's way more money going into climate addressing. So I'm not surprised that there's a group out there that was able to develop what you're talking about. If we had those resources, we could do the same, sure. And gear the interaction, as it were, toward steady statesmanship, as we like to call it. I mean, we do have some friends and allies at the UN, in the UN, that'll show up in places like the COP conventions on biodiversity and on climate, but we're not nearly as well distributed as they are. Climate Interactive, I mean.
Yeah, if folks haven't seen it, it's pretty amazing. You can actually just log on and try it. And they offer free training for people who want to become what they call climate ambassadors. And what they've done is taken, software that was specialist software, and they basically make it like live charts, and you can simulate policy settings where people do live role play. And you can see how the decisions you make affect the climate and the economy and people's well-being. So it's already kind of an illustration that could, as is, can be used for this purpose, but could potentially be adapted to. Anyway, if folks haven't looked at it, it's worth, I think, poking at, and I'd be happy to follow up with anybody who wants more info. I did the training, but I'm not a ambassador or anything, officially. I did the training and would like to find folks to talk with about that kind of stuff. And I think just the tool set, in addition to the philosophy, could also be helpful here.
Okay. So when you've been in there looking at the simulators and stuff, are you allowed to tinker with rates of GDP growth as part of the simulations?
Yeah, I am. In fact, in one of our simulations, I took the role of somebody demanding that growth was the enemy, and I requested formally that we would zero it out, and had an argument with other leftists, right, about it, and that was something that we all learned from. And the messiness of making policy and that kind of stuff was part of the simulation, and part of the role play as well. So yeah, I think it would be pretty neat, and if people are interested in doing a session, even I could facilitate that potentially.
That sounds like a really powerful tool for getting people on board. Thanks for sharing.
Okay. Yeah, try to follow up, but yeah, encourage folks to take a look at it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have another question for the presenters from Forrest. Is France's law to ban air travel between cities where high-speed train routes exist an example of a command and control approach?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Easy answer.
That command and control, another synonym for that is prohibitive policy. And that was all the rage during the environmental movement of late 60s to the late 70s. Endangered Species Act, maybe the best example of prohibitive policy and environmental law in the world. It literally prohibits you from doing this or that activity if you're going to endanger species or destroy designated critical habitat. So it stops. It's like that Endangered Species Act is kind of like an implicit prescription for a steady state economy. The economy grows, it endangers more and more species out there. And if the Endangered Species Act is fully funded and supported by Congress and the administration, as that Endangered Species Act functions, it's like a bunch of little stop signs coming up all around the country, stop signs to the GDP bulldozer. And it would absolutely function toward a steady state economy, but that's not the case that it's fully funded and fully supported these days.
To Forrest's example about banning air travel between cities, one of the earliest Steady State Economy Act feeder bills we developed was the Forgoing Flights for America the Beautiful Act, right, Brian?
Well, it's not part of the Steady State Economy Act, but it is one of the first bills that we developed. Yes, Foregoing Flights for America the Beautiful Act. Yep.
Thanks, guys.
It's a phased program to it starts with limiting private jet ownership, numbers of flights per year for people, and it's prohibitive policy or command and control against, what do they call those, fruitless flights, or there people get up in the air and fly around and come back to the exact same spot without ever stopping anywhere else. It's like frivolous flight. So that was banned in the Foregoing Flights Act. Very premature. We should, Alex, we probably ought to mention, our people are going to think we're nuts. We're not deluded enough to think that much of the Steady State Economy Act is ready at this point in history for Congress, for the US Congress. We're thinking maybe the Congress of the sometime in the 2040s. Hopefully by then, we'll be ready and willing and able to deal with limits to growth, partly because of the efforts of all of us here this evening, and our friends and allies in post-growth and Extinction Rebellion.
Thanks, Brian.
Good.
Maybe time for
Question.
one more question. I've got one in the chat, and then yes, I think Paul, you had one too.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so the one from the chat is from, I think, Michael. How much has Steady State scholarship integrated with Indigenous communities and their frameworks?
You can take that one, Alex.
Well, I know, for example, there was a gathering of sort of post-growth folks who were trying to organize the next degrowth conference, international degrowth conference, to be in North America, and they were looking to partner with indigenous groups here. And I know that that has been a big priority to sort of respect and weave in indigenous perspectives and bring indigenous communities in whenever possible. CASSE has at least one endorsement of our position on economic growth from a tribal group. Brian, I'm forgetting.
Yeah, the Buffalo Commons group associated with the Wind River Reservation.
Yeah.
And I think there's another similar group in New Mexico that endorsed it.
Yeah, and I would say that some of the stuff that I've read that's more about like sort of the cultural shift and the shift in values that we need is very much inspired by indigenous ideas of reciprocity, that whatever we take from the earth, we should be intentional about giving back. That obviously we need to take as humans, we consume, we need to live, and we require resources. And so it's about having an attitude of gratitude and reciprocity. Yeah, I see that pretty prevalent in the degrowth literature.
That's a good point. And in public policy, even we in what is it? I think in the Sustainable Budgets Act, we decided we had to have a definition of long term to make any sense out of sustainable budgeting over time. And so we got very literal about it. We defined long term as 150 years. And then not in the legislation, because you can't do that kind of thing in but in the accompanying article, the kickoff article, we related that to the indigenous wisdom of 7 generations. We're trying to protect our 7 generations out, and that's about 150 years. So it's way longer than these rinky-dink political cycles, but yet it's not so far out as to be irrelevant. People think about their grandkids and great-grandkids and stuff.
That's great, thank you. So we've got one more minute. I just want to say that we are going to be sending out an email with a recording of this and the info and resources that people have shared, and maybe Alex and Brian's slides as well. Sorry, Paul, I think you had a question, but I don't want to keep folks past. Maybe Alex or Brian, if you're open to having questions emailed to you, that would be possible.
Of course,
Yep.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Paul's one of our friends, so we'll definitely be
Great.
in touch with him again.
I was just going to ask you, Brian, since you're looking long term, what do we do now? So that's, I mean,
well,
long term is
we
great.
can take care of that within the next 10 seconds.
Yeah, but I mean, there's stuff we can do now, and our group actually talked about that. So,
Well, I
but if
think
we're out of time,
Alex gave a pretty good summary along those lines, and I hope that the video will be out there so we can circulate it. And I noticed we already got people signing the CASSE position. Thank you so much, XRDC, for helping with that, because that's a real significant step. We feel there's so many values and uses to a long list of signatories supporting a paradigm shifting policy, and it helps tremendously to be able to show that support to policymakers. So thanks again, XRDC, for helping us out with that.
It's great. Thanks for being with us today. Thanks everyone for joining us. If you're interested in taking action locally, please contact XRDC, and we can talk more about ways to take action in the DC area. Thanks for joining us from other places as well. It's really been really great, rich conversations today. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks
Good.
all. Good night.
Stay warm.
Yeah.
You.